Welcome everybody to the next edition of uh, Mistress of Philosophy. And today is the final unit in the Introduction to Philosophy series. From next playlist onwards, we are going to look at some problems of Indian philosophy. So let me just let you know, those of you who are popping in right today for the first time, there are 5 more videos previously that I talked about what is Indian about Indian philosophy and whether Indian philosophy is a kind of a philosophy or what is the confusion about the word Indian and the word philosophy and how it is done in academics and so on and so forth. So if you have the patience, please watch back because from what we're going to do next week, you're going to have a little more fun with analogical thinking in Indian philosophy, because one of the ways Indian philosophy is done is through these various examples of the fire and the smoke and the lotus in the sky and things like that. And reality is discussed through these examples, and they debate hours and hours over these examples, especially in the classical tradition. So I thought I'll do a story series of examples, putting them into fables and parables, and kind of making it easier and much more fun for you to look at these analogies that are used in discussing philosophy. Yeah, and by the way, this is not peculiar to Indian philosophies. Analogies are used in Western philosophy also. We have Descartes thinking he's sitting in front of the fire and falling asleep and thinking, oh, what if I didn't have a body? And what if there's an evil demon making me think all that I want to think? And so it's pretty easy for people to think about stuff and imagine stuff and then do debates about it. So, yeah, you will think these philosophers have no other work, but thinking is hard work. I often feel hungrier after I've written a paper. So back to Indian philosophy now. I just wanted to mention 2 or 3 things before we close up the introduction to Indian philosophy. When we do Indian philosophy, it's very difficult to do it in a historical way, the way we do Western philosophy, because Indian philosophy is about continuities and discontinuities. And what do I mean by that? Because sometimes what happens is that you have a philosopher 11th century Shankaracharya or 12th century Shankaracharya or maybe 8th century. We never know, because we have various people telling us when it is possible that they would have written a text. So dating Indian philosophical texts or Indian philosophers is very difficult. And so you will have somebody like Shankaracharya writing something way in, you know, 8th or 9th or 12th century or 11th century, and then very much later in the 14th century some other philosopher will pick up his text and respond or critique him. Madhvacharya in the 12th 13th century picks up this text and critiques Shankaracharya, and then somebody else, Nyaya text, which is somewhere again in the 8th or 9th or 10th century, will be picked up by somebody else in the 11th century, and then there'll be a debate between the texts. Perhaps it was like the postage service was really slow, because there was no postage service. There was no way you could know that, this funny story that when Mahavira was about 90, Buddha was just a few kilometers away from him teaching in Sarnath. And the whole question is, did they ever meet? Probably they didn't know, because we couldn't WhatsApp or Facebook the events. And so it's impossible to imagine that people were so much it gets impossible for us to imagine that they were out of communication, because we are in this world where I can be sitting in India and talking to in the US, or I know everything about everywhere instantaneously. And so to imagine a world where it took a little more time, perhaps years, before you could get a particular manuscript or a particular text of some other person. And sometimes what would happen is some disciple of that teacher will wander back into your ashram, and you would say, hey, what does your teacher say? And then the disciple would say whatever he said. And as you know, students, they won't listen to the teacher fully. So whatever the disciple says is true, and the scholar will respond to what the disciple says. So perhaps it was all a complete case of miscommunication. And so you would have texts being weird about people, and they would rather not cite the names. They would rather say, oh, the people who believe that the self is supreme say this, but we oppose it. And they would do these debates in the text. So there are lots of discontinuities because some philosophies just die out. Some philosophies suddenly emerge out of nowhere. We don't know who the people were. Were the Nayayika Shaivites? Did they worship Shiva? Did they follow the religion of Pashupata? Or were they all like atheists? Or were they people who were pujaris in a temple? We don't know. There's nothing about these philosophers that we know. And most of them preferred not to put their names. They liked the anonymity, or maybe they just didn't want to take responsibilities for the kinds of texts they write. Some of them really clearly say, I am Ishvara Krishna and I'm composing this for this. I am Jayatirtha and I'm going to break down all the arguments of my opponents and stuff like that. But most of them remained anonymous. The second point is, when we study Indian philosophy in the modern age, we often tend to treat it like archaeology. Imagine the shock of a philosopher when I went and told him, I have invented a new kind of Sankhya. And he's like, you can't do that. You can't call it Sankhya, because if Sankhya is this. So it's like an archaeological remains of a canonical text collection that you can talk about, that you can conceptualize about, that you can draw things about, but you have to stay within the text. You can't pull out something from Sankhya and make it larger or smaller or change it, because then it won't remain Sankhya. So dealing with Indian philosophical texts is like dealing with archaeological artifacts. You have to be very careful, because you can't destroy them, you can't critique them, because within the tradition there is no critique. So you can't also speculate, because that's not allowed within the system. So it's like playing, they've already invented this game called Sankhya and the rules are all set. So any modification to Sankhya philosophy you do now would be considered either an affront or to the philosophy itself, because no, this is not there in Sankhya. Or it would be considered a kind of a subversive act, where how dare you think you're as clever as Ishvara Krishna. Or it will be considered like, no, what you're doing is philosophy, but I think it's all speculation. It's not good at this moment. So it is impossible to work with texts of Indian philosophy and try and extrapolate them into contemporary times. I've had success in 2 or 3 things, but only about 4 concepts or 5 concepts. And it has taken a hell of a lot of writing and Scopus Index papers to prove a point that you can talk about Sthala and Sthana and place studies, for example. So Indian philosophy as an archaeological artifact. So you can't pretty much do anything with it. So you end up studying these texts. And these texts are not 1 or 2. The texts are many. These are canons, right? So they're what I call canonical literature, or the great literatures. Sometimes they're called Prasthanatraya in Vedanta, for example, consists of the Bhagavad Gita, the Upanishads, and the Brahma Sutras. So everybody who's doing Vedanta has to do these 3 texts. There's a big argument whether who established the Prasthanatraya, or are these only texts which are authority for Vedanta. So they are the canonical literature. And then there are these texts which are written by the founders of religion. Let us say Ishvara Krishna Sankhya Karika or Mula Madhyama Karika. So the Karikas are basically exponential accounts of philosophy. So then there are what you call commentaries written on these texts. So you would have Mandukya Karika being written on Mandukya Upanishad, and then Shankaracharya will write a bhashya for his teachers Govindapada's Karika. So you would have a bhashya. A bhashya is nothing but a commentary. Then for the bhashya, you will have a secondary bhashya written by his student. Like every favorite student will get their position in the lineage of teachers if they are able to write a good commentary on what their teacher said. And so what you would have is then a upabhashya, a secondary commentary. Then you'll have a tika. A tika is nothing but a notation, or maybe the class notes which were taken by some students and put together in the form of text because they're very interesting. So you'll have tika. Then you'll have upatika, which is like the notes on the notes, or footnotes for the notes, and so on and so forth. So the idea of textual traditions is so complicated. Every text has supposed to have a particular chapterization. The first verse must salute the teacher, then state the purpose of the text, and then The examples must be commonplace. You cannot give examples which are particulars. They should be perceivable even to the general mind. And there are all these rules and regulations for writing text. So Shastra is another word for text that they use, basically canons, you can say, or they are Sanskrit texts. They could also be written in Pali, Prakrit, or Tamil, any of the classical languages. But most of the time, the Shastras have a particular way of explaining a subject. So you could call them theses. I hate the word science because it's nothing to do with science. It's a way of presentation, which is a logical order of a presentation of a subject. So these are Shastras, or they're a compilation of certain kinds of disciplines or knowledges. So discipline seems to be a very nice translation for Shastras. I don't know if it has been used, because when you say Vedanta Shastra, it's a Vedantic discipline, and in the terms of subject-wise division. Then finally, I want to end with a small idea that perhaps Indian philosophy is what Indian philosophers have done so far. So if you look back and see that these are the Indian philosophers, and we consider them Indian philosophers because they were somewhere in and around the geographical geographical spread of Indian subcontinent. And so what they did is philosophy, but they did engage in some commonalities, which we will be talking about. And so the first of them is the use of examples. And we start with the example stories, which is a subversive way of teaching Indian philosophy. So watch out for some storytelling from the next session onwards. So have a nice day. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel. And please do watch my episodes in continuity, because sometimes if you jump right in, it'll be a little confusing. And sorry for being so casual. That's my style. As I said, this is a fun channel, and I intend it to be not a substitute for a classroom teaching. Bye, and see you next week.